The autumn of 1934 brought more than just falling leaves to the dust-choked town of Copper Ridge, Arizona. It brought desperation so thick you could taste it in the air, mixed with the grit that never seemed to settle. In a ramshackle cabin on the outskirts of town, where the paint had long since peeled away and the roof leaked in 3 places, a decision was being made that would haunt a family forever. 17-year-old Rebecca Martinez stood at the cracked kitchen window, her hand resting protectively over her swollen belly, watching her father count and recount 5 crumpled dollar bills on the wooden table behind her. She didn't know yet that those $5 represented the price her father had placed on her life. She didn't know that in less than an hour, a stranger would arrive to claim what had been bought and paid for. But it wasn't the money that would change everything. It wasn't even the mysterious figure who would soon appear at their door, his face hidden beneath a burlap sack that concealed secrets no one could have imagined. It was what happened when that sack finally came off, and the truth beneath it shattered everything Rebecca thought she knew about betrayal, sacrifice, and the lengths a parent will go to save their child. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Great Depression had hit Copper Ridge like a sledgehammer to the chest, leaving most families gasping for breath and grasping for any lifeline that might keep them afloat. The Martinez family had been drowning for months. Esteban Martinez sat hunched over the kitchen table in the pre-dawn darkness, his weathered hands trembling as he stared at the eviction notice that had arrived 3 days ago. 48 hours. That's all the time he had left before the bank would come to seize the only home his family had ever known. Behind him, the soft sounds of his pregnant daughter's restless sleep drifted down from the loft above, while his wife Maria knelt in the corner, her rosary beads clicking softly as she whispered prayers that seemed to fall on deaf ears. Esteban was 53 years old, but the past 2 years had aged him a decade. His back, once strong from years of railroad work, was now permanently bent from the injury that had cost him his job. The copper mine had closed 6 months ago, taking with it the last steady employment in town. His wife's seamstress work brought in barely enough to buy flour and beans, and even those were becoming luxuries they could hardly afford. But it was Rebecca's condition that had driven him to the edge of madness. His 17-year-old daughter, unmarried and 6 months pregnant, had become the subject of whispered conversations and pointed fingers throughout their small community. The father of her child, a smooth-talking drifter named Tommy Sullivan, had vanished the moment he learned about the baby, leaving behind nothing but shame and an impossible burden. The town doctor had made it clear that Rebecca would need proper medical care when her time came, care that would cost more money than Esteban had seen in a year. Without it, both mother and child could die. The choice was stark: find the money somehow, or watch his daughter and grandchild perish for lack of what others took for granted. Maria looked up from her prayers, her dark eyes reflecting years of worry and sacrifice. "There has to be another way, Esteban," she whispered, though they both knew they had exhausted every possibility. They had sold everything of value: Maria's wedding ring, Esteban's tools, even the family Bible that had belonged to his grandmother. They had begged relatives who were struggling just as much, pleaded with the bank for more time, and even considered the charity organizations that looked down on them with thinly veiled disgust. "There is no other way," Esteban replied, his voice hollow with defeat. "You know there isn't." The conversation was interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps on the wooden stairs. Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her long black hair disheveled from sleep, one hand supporting her back as she navigated the narrow steps. Even 6 months pregnant, she moved with the grace that had once made her the prettiest girl in Copper Ridge, though now her beauty was shadowed by exhaustion and worry. "Papa? Mama?" "I heard voices," she said, settling carefully into one of the mismatched chairs around the table. Is everything all right? Esteban couldn't meet his daughter's eyes. How could he tell her what he was considering? How could he explain that a man had approached him yesterday outside the general store? A man whose face was hidden beneath a burlap sack, who had somehow known about their desperate situation and made an offer that was both salvation and damnation. The stranger had spoken with a clear, educated voice that didn't match his strange appearance. He claimed to be traveling through the territory, collecting stories and helping families in need. He had heard about Rebecca's situation, he said, and he had a proposition that could solve all their problems. $5 enough to pay the doctor, buy food for months, and keep the bank at bay until Esteban could find work again. All in exchange for Rebecca coming with him to serve as a companion to his elderly aunt, who lived in a large house several days' journey north. It sounded reasonable, even generous when the stranger explained it. Rebecca would have comfortable accommodations, proper medical care when her time came, and the baby would be born into a household that could provide for its needs. After a year, she could return home if she chose, or stay and build a new life for herself and her child. But there was something about the man that had made Esteban's skin crawl, something beyond just the bizarre covering that concealed his features. The way he seemed to know too much about their situation, the way he had appeared at exactly the moment when their desperation had reached its peak, the way he insisted the arrangement be made immediately, without time for proper consideration. Rebecca. Esteban began, then stopped, the words sticking in his throat like broken glass. Maria reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "Mia, we need to talk to you about something important." Rebecca looked between her parents, reading the tension in their faces with the instinct that comes from living in close quarters with people you love. "What is it? Has something happened?" Man came to see your father yesterday," Maria said carefully. "He made us an offer." "What kind of offer?" Esteban finally raised his eyes to meet his daughter's gaze, and she saw something there that made her blood run cold. It was the look of a man who had already made a decision he could never take back. "He wants to help us," Esteban said, the words coming out in a rush. "He has an aunt who needs a companion, someone young and capable who can help around the house. He's offering to pay us and to provide for you and the baby. Full medical care, food, shelter, everything we can't give you here." Rebecca's hand instinctively moved to her belly, and in return, you would go with him. Live in his aunt's house until after the baby comes, maybe longer. The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, its cry echoing the anguish that was building in Rebecca's chest. "You want to send me away," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "We want to save your life," Maria said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "And the baby's life." "Rebecca, we can't afford the doctor. We can't even afford food for another week. The bank is going to take the house, and then where will we go? What will happen to you when your time comes?" Rebecca stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the rough wooden floor. She walked to the window and stared out at the barren landscape that stretched toward the horizon, painted silver by moonlight. Somewhere out there was the future her parents were asking her to accept, a future with strangers, in a place she'd never seen, dependent on the charity of people who might not have her best interests at heart. But behind her, in this cramped cabin that smelled of wood smoke and desperation, was the reality she couldn't escape. Her parents were growing thinner by the day, worry etched into every line of their faces. The eviction notice lay on the table like a death sentence, and her own body was changing in ways that would soon require help they simply couldn't provide. "What do you know about this man?" she asked without turning around. "Not much," Esteban admitted. "He keeps his face covered, says it's because of a disfigurement from an accident. But he speaks well, has money, and he seems to know about medical matters. He promised that you and the baby would receive the best care available. And you trust him?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Esteban wanted to say yes, wanted to believe that this stranger represented genuine help rather than something darker. But trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. "I trust that the alternative is worse," he said finally. Rebecca turned back to face her parents, her young face set with a determination that made her look older than her 17 years. She had inherited her father's strong jaw and her mother's expressive eyes, but now those features were arranged in an expression of resolve that neither parent had seen before. "How much is he paying?" she asked. $5, Esteban said, shame coloring his voice. "I know it doesn't sound like much, but $5. Rebecca repeated the amount, and something in her tone made both parents look up sharply. "You're selling me for $5. "Rebecca, no." Maria stood up quickly, reaching for her daughter. "It's not like that. This is about keeping you safe, about making sure you and the baby survive." "It's exactly like that, Mama." Rebecca's voice was steady, but tears were starting to fall. "You're taking money from a stranger in exchange for your daughter. That's what selling means." The accusation hit Esteban like a physical blow. He had told himself the same thing, that this was about salvation, not sale. That the money was secondary to the promise of care and safety. But hearing it from Rebecca's lips forced him to confront the ugly truth of what he was contemplating. "What choice do I have?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Tell me, Rebecca, what choice do any of us have?" Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, her hand moving in slow circles over her belly as she felt the baby shift inside her. 6 months along, and already she could feel the child's personality emerging, active during the day, restless at night. As if it too sensed the uncertainty of the world it would soon enter. "When is he coming?" she asked finally. "Tomorrow evening," Esteban said. "But Rebecca, if you truly don't want to go, if you can think of any other way, there is no other way." Rebecca interrupted, echoing her father's earlier words. "You've made that clear." She walked to the stairs, then paused with one foot on the bottom step. "I have one condition." "What is it?" Maria asked. "I want to meet him first. I want to look him in the eye, or as close as I can get with that sack over his head, and hear this proposition from his own lips. If I'm going to be sold, I at least want to know who's buying me." With that, she climbed the stairs to the loft, leaving her parents alone with their guilt and their impossible choices. Above them, they could hear the creak of the floorboards as she paced, and both of them wondered if they were saving their daughter's life or destroying it. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose shutters and sending dust swirling around the cabin. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, promising rain that might break the drought, or bring flooding that could wash away what little they had left. Neither Esteban nor Maria slept that night. They sat at the kitchen table, holding hands and watching the candle burn down to nothing, both of them praying to a God who seemed to have forgotten their existence. They had made their choice, struck their bargain, and now all that remained was to see what price they would ultimately pay for their daughter's survival. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold that matched the town's name, Rebecca came downstairs dressed in her best dress, a simple blue cotton frock that Maria had sewn before the baby started showing. She had braided her hair carefully and pinned it up in a style that made her look more mature, more capable of handling whatever lay ahead. "I'm ready," she said simply. But none of them were ready for what would happen when the sun set that evening, when a figure would appear at their door with his face hidden beneath a burlap sack, carrying secrets that would turn their understanding of sacrifice and desperation completely upside down. They weren't ready to learn that sometimes the most terrifying strangers are the ones who know exactly what we need to hear, and that the price of salvation is rarely what it appears to be. The man with the sack was coming, and with him, a truth that would change everything Rebecca thought she knew about love, loss, and the lengths to which people will go to protect the ones they cherish most. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe. To our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sun hung low over Copper Ridge like a dying ember, casting long shadows across the desert floor as evening approached. Rebecca sat on the front porch of the cabin, her hands folded over her belly, watching the horizon for any sign of movement. The wooden chair creaked beneath her as she shifted, trying to find a comfortable position that seemed increasingly impossible as the baby grew larger. Inside the cabin, she could hear her parents moving about with nervous energy, her mother cleaning surfaces that were already spotless, her father checking and rechecking the few remaining possessions they hadn't been forced to sell. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Rebecca found herself almost wishing the mysterious stranger would arrive just to end the waiting. The past 24 hours had been the longest of her life. After accepting the inevitable nature of her situation, Rebecca had spent the day trying to prepare herself mentally for whatever lay ahead. She had packed her few belongings into a small canvas bag: 2 dresses, some undergarments, her mother's old hairbrush, and the wooden cross her grandmother had given her for her confirmation. It wasn't much to show for 17 years of life, but then again, the past 6 months had taught her that you could lose everything you thought mattered and still find ways to keep breathing. She had also spent considerable time thinking about the baby growing inside her. At 6 months, the child was becoming more real to her every day. She could feel its movements, strong kicks that sometimes took her breath away, gentle flutters that reminded her she wasn't alone even in her darkest moments. The baby deserved a chance at life, deserved proper medical care, and enough food to grow healthy and strong. If accepting this stranger's offer was the only way to provide those things, then she would find the courage to do it. But that didn't make the fear any less real. A dust cloud appeared on the horizon, growing larger as it approached the cabin. Rebecca's heart began to pound as she realized this had to be him, the man who had made the offer that would change her life forever. She called out to her parents, and within moments, Esteban and Maria emerged from the cabin to stand beside her on the porch. The approaching figure was still too far away to make out clearly, but Rebecca could see that he was riding alone on horseback, leading a second horse behind him. As he drew closer, more details became visible. He was tall, sitting straight in the saddle with the confidence of someone comfortable with long distances and rough terrain. He wore dark clothing, black pants, a dark shirt, and what appeared to be a long coat. Despite the warm evening air, and covering his entire head was the burlap sack that Esteban had described, tied loosely around his neck and hanging down to his shoulders. It was crude and unsettling, with rough holes cut out for his eyes, giving him an appearance that was somewhere between mysterious and menacing. The stranger brought his horse to a stop about 20 feet from the cabin and dismounted with fluid grace. When he spoke, his voice was clear and educated, carrying easily across the distance between them. "Good evening, Mr. Martinez. I trust you've had time to consider my proposition." Esteban stepped forward, his body tense with the protective instincts of a father who was about to hand over his daughter to a complete stranger. "We have, but before we discuss anything further, my daughter wants to hear the terms directly from you." The stranger turned his attention to Rebecca, and even through the rough holes in the burlap, she could feel the intensity of his gaze. There was something unsettling about being studied so carefully by someone whose face she couldn't see, but she forced herself to meet what she assumed were his eyes without flinching. "Miss Martinez," he said, inclining his head slightly, "I'm honored to meet you. Your father has told me about your situation, and I believe I can offer a solution that benefits everyone involved." Rebecca stood up slowly, using the porch railing for support. "I'd like to hear about this solution, Mr. You may call me Samuel," the stranger replied. "Though names are often less important than intentions, don't you think?" There was something in his tone that made Rebecca uneasy, a suggestion that he knew more about intentions, hers and others, than he was letting on. But she pressed forward with her questions. My father says you have an aunt who needs a companion. Tell me about her." Samuel was quiet for a moment, and Rebecca had the strange feeling that he was considering how much truth to reveal. When he spoke, his words were carefully chosen. "My aunt is elderly and lives alone in a large house about 3 days' ride north of here. She has been quite isolated since my uncle's death several years ago, and she would benefit greatly from the company of a young woman. In return, she would provide comfortable accommodations, proper meals, and access to medical care when your time comes." "And after the baby is born?" "That would depend on what you choose to do. You would be welcome to stay as long as you like. Or you could return to your family if that's what you prefer. The choice would be entirely yours." It sounded reasonable, even generous, but Rebecca had learned to be suspicious of things that seemed too good to be true. Why would your aunt want a stranger in her house? Why not hire someone from her own community? "My aunt has very specific needs," Samuel replied. "She requires someone young and adaptable, someone who understands hardship and won't be put off by unusual circumstances. From what I've heard about your situation, you seem to fit those requirements perfectly." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of unusual circumstances? Samuel shifted slightly, and the burlap sack moved with him, creating an even more unsettling effect. "My aunt has certain eccentricities, shall we say. She keeps unusual hours, has particular dietary requirements, and prefers to avoid contact with the local community. Nothing dangerous or improper. You understand, but she needs someone who can adapt to her way of life without asking too many questions." The explanation raised more questions than it answered, but before Rebecca could voice them, Esteban stepped forward with obvious impatience. "The important thing is that Rebecca and the baby will be safe and properly cared for," he said. "Isn't that right, Mr. Samuel?" "Absolutely," Samuel replied without hesitation. "Your daughter's welfare is my primary concern." Maria had been silent throughout the exchange, but now she spoke up with a mother's instinct for danger. "Why do you keep your face covered? What kind of disfigurement could be so terrible that you hide it even when meeting strangers?" Samuel turned toward her, and even through the burlap, Rebecca could sense his attention focusing on her mother with uncomfortable intensity. "Mrs. Martinez, some scars are not just physical. Some wounds go deeper than skin and bone, and the sight of them can be disturbing to others. I wear this covering out of consideration for people like yourselves, who have enough troubles without being subjected to unpleasant sights." The explanation was reasonable, but something about the way he delivered it made Rebecca's skin crawl. There was an undertone in his voice, a suggestion that his reasons for hiding his face went beyond simple courtesy or self-consciousness. "I'd like to see your face," Rebecca said suddenly, surprising herself with her boldness. Samuel went very still. "I'm afraid that's not possible, Miss Martinez. I have strict personal policies about if I'm going to trust you with my life and my baby's life. I want to see who you really are," Rebecca interrupted. "Just for a moment, please." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Esteban looked uncomfortable with his daughter's directness, while Maria watched Samuel with growing suspicion. The stranger himself seemed to be engaged in some internal struggle, weighing options that none of them could understand. Finally, Samuel shook his head. "I'm sorry, but I cannot accommodate that request. However, I can offer you something else, a chance to speak with someone who can vouch for my character and the legitimacy of my offer." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "This is a letter from Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, who practices in Flagstaff. She has worked with my family for many years and can attest to both my aunt's need for a companion and my ability to provide proper care for you and your child." Esteban took the letter and unfolded it carefully. The paper was expensive, and the handwriting was clearly that of an educated person. He read it slowly, his lips moving slightly as he worked through the formal language. "She says you're a man of means and good character, Esteban said finally. She confirms that your aunt requires assistance and that you've helped other young women in similar situations. Other women? Rebecca asked sharply. What other women? Samuel seemed to realize he had revealed more than he intended. My aunt has had several companions over the years. Young women who needed help, who benefited from her generosity and medical connections. All of them left her employ safely and with their situations much improved. Where are they now? Rebecca pressed. Can I speak with any of them? I'm afraid they've moved on to other parts of the territory, Samuel replied smoothly. But Dr. Whitfield can provide references if you require them. Rebecca felt increasingly uneasy with each exchange. Everything Samuel said had a logical explanation. But the explanations always seemed to raise new questions, rather than providing real answers. She was beginning to understand why her father had felt uncertain about this arrangement, despite their desperate circumstances. But then the baby kicked hard against her ribs, reminding her of the reality of her situation. In less than 3 months, this child would need to be born, preferably with medical assistance and in clean, safe conditions. Her parents simply couldn't provide those things, and there were no other options presenting themselves. The payment, she said finally. My father mentioned $5. Samuel reached into his coat again and withdrew a small leather pouch. The coins inside clinked softly as he handed it to Esteban. $5 silver, as promised. Enough to pay your debts and keep your family comfortable for several months. Esteban opened the pouch and stared at the coins as if he couldn't quite believe they were real. $5 was more money than he'd seen at one time in over a year. It would pay the doctor's fee for Rebecca's delivery, buy food for months, and give them time to find other solutions to their problems. But as he looked at the money, then at his daughter, then at the strange figure who was offering to take her away, Esteban felt his resolve beginning to waver. Rebecca, he said quietly, you don't have to do this. We can find another way. Rebecca looked at her father's face, seeing the hope and desperation warring in his eyes. She looked at her mother, who was clutching her rosary so tightly her knuckles had gone white. She looked at the mysterious Samuel, whose hidden face seemed to hold secrets that might be better left unexplored. And then she felt the baby move again, a gentle flutter that reminded her that this decision wasn't just about her own life anymore. I'll go, she said quietly, but I have conditions. Samuel inclined his head. Name them. I want to write to my parents regularly, and I want them to be able to write to me. I want to know exactly where I'm going and how to get back here if I need to. And I want your promise that if I choose to leave after the baby is born, you'll provide transportation back to my family. All reasonable requests, Samuel agreed. I can provide you with maps and detailed directions to my aunt's house. As for correspondence, that might be challenging, given the remote location. But I'll do my best to facilitate communication when possible. Another vague answer that sounded reasonable but provided no real assurance. Rebecca was beginning to see a pattern in Samuel's responses. Everything was possible, but nothing was guaranteed. Everything sounded helpful, but the details were always just out of reach. When do we leave? She asked. Tomorrow morning, at first light. The journey will take 3 days, and it's best to travel during the cooler parts of the day. Rebecca nodded, then walked to where her parents stood together, looking lost and frightened. She hugged them both, feeling her mother's tears against her cheek and her father's trembling hands on her back. This is the right thing to do, she whispered to them. For all of us. But even as she spoke the words, Rebecca wasn't entirely sure she believed them. There was something about Samuel that made her skin crawl, something about his offer that seemed too convenient, too perfectly timed to their desperation. Still, what choice did she have? Her parents were facing eviction, she was facing childbirth, without medical care, and the baby was facing a future of poverty and hardship that could prove fatal. Samuel mounted his horse and adjusted the burlap sack around his neck. "I'll return at dawn, Miss Martinez. I suggest you get a good night's rest. Tomorrow begins a new chapter of your life." As he rode away into the gathering darkness, Rebecca watched until his figure disappeared completely. Only then did she realize that in all their conversation, he had never once removed his gloves, never revealed even an inch of skin beyond what was visible through the rough holes in his burlap covering. Whatever secrets Samuel was hiding beneath that sack, Rebecca had the disturbing feeling that she was about to discover them, whether she wanted to or not. And despite his promises of safety and care, she couldn't shake the growing certainty that she was walking into a situation far more dangerous than anything she was leaving behind. The baby kicked again, and Rebecca placed both hands over her belly, whispering a prayer for strength and protection. Tomorrow she would climb onto a horse with a complete stranger and ride into an unknown future, trusting her life and her child's life to someone whose face she had never seen. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Rebecca wondered if she would ever see her parents or her home again. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that some bargains, no matter how desperate the circumstances, were simply too dangerous to make. Dawn came too quickly and not quickly enough. Rebecca had spent the night drifting between fitful sleep and wide-awake anxiety, her mind racing with questions about what lay ahead. When the first pale light of morning began to creep through the cabin's single window, she was already dressed and sitting on the edge of her narrow bed, her packed bag at her feet. The baby had been restless all night, turning and kicking as if it too sensed the approaching change. Rebecca placed her hands on her belly and whispered soft words of reassurance, though she wasn't sure whether she was trying to comfort the child or herself. From downstairs came the sounds of her parents, moving about, preparing what might be their last breakfast together for months or possibly forever. The thought made Rebecca's throat tighten with emotion, but she forced herself to stay strong. Tears would only make this harder for everyone. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke the morning silence. Samuel had arrived precisely at dawn, just as he had promised. Rebecca gathered her bag and made her way downstairs, where her parents were waiting with forced smiles and red-rimmed eyes. Maria had prepared a simple meal of beans and tortillas, but none of them had much appetite. They ate in relative silence, the weight of the approaching separation making conversation seem impossible. Through the window, they could see Samuel sitting motionless on his horse, the burlap sack covering his head making him look like some sort of grim specter waiting to collect what he was owed. "I made you some food for the journey," Maria said, wrapping several tortillas and some dried meat in a clean cloth. "It's not much, but it should help sustain you." Rebecca accepted the bundle gratefully, tucking it into her bag. "Thank you, Mama, for everything." Esteban cleared his throat roughly. "Rebecca, I want you to know, if I had any other choice, any other way to keep you safe." "I know, Papa," Rebecca interrupted gently. "This isn't your fault. None of this is anyone's fault. We're doing what we have to do." But even as she spoke the words, Rebecca couldn't quite convince herself they were true. Surely there had to be other options, other ways to find help. The fact that a mysterious stranger had appeared at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right offer, seemed too convenient to be mere coincidence. Yet here she was, about to climb onto a horse with him and ride into an unknown future. A sharp knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Samuel's voice carried clearly through the thin wood. "Miss Martinez, it's time to depart. We have a long day's ride ahead of us." Rebecca stood up slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if protesting this sudden upheaval. She hugged her parents one final time, memorizing the feel of their arms around her, the familiar sense of her mother's hair and her father's work-worn shirt. "I love you both," she whispered. "No matter what happens, remember that I love you." Maria began to cry softly, and Esteban's jaw worked as he struggled to maintain his composure. "We love you too, Mia. Be safe, be careful, and come home to us when you can." Rebecca walked to the door and opened it to find Samuel waiting with the second horse he had brought the previous evening. It was a gentle-looking mare, brown with white markings, and already saddled for the journey. The animal seemed calm and well-trained, which provided some small measure of reassurance. "This is Esperanza," Samuel said, gesturing to the mare. "She's very gentle and experienced with long journeys. She'll take good care of you." Rebecca approached the horse slowly, extending her hand for the animal to sniff. Esperanza nuzzled her palm softly, and Rebecca felt a tiny spark of hope. At least she would have one friendly companion on this journey into the unknown. Samuel dismounted and moved to help Rebecca into the saddle, but she waved him away. "I can manage," she said, not wanting this stranger to touch her any more than absolutely necessary. It took some effort to mount the horse with her pregnant belly, but Rebecca managed it with a grace born of necessity. She had ridden horses before, though not often and never while 6 months pregnant. The sensation of being up so high, with the baby shifting inside her, was disorienting at first. Her parents emerged from the cabin to watch her departure. Maria clutched her rosary, lips moving in silent prayer, while Esteban stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of controlled anguish. "The journey to my aunt's house will take 3 days, Samuel explained as he remounted his own horse. "We'll travel during the cooler hours and rest during the heat of the day. There are safe places to stop along the way." Rebecca nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She took one last look at the cabin that had been her home for 17 years, at her parents standing in the doorway looking smaller and more fragile than she had ever seen them, at the familiar landscape of red rock and scrub brush that had defined her entire world. Then Samuel clicked his tongue to his horse and began moving north, and Rebecca had no choice but to follow. The first few hours of riding passed in relative silence. Samuel led the way along what appeared to be a well-traveled trail, though Rebecca saw no signs of other travelers. The desert landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the occasional mesa or cluster of rocks. The sun climbed steadily higher, and even though it was still early autumn, the heat was beginning to build. As they rode, Rebecca found herself studying Samuel's back, looking for any clues about who he really was. He sat his horse with the confidence of someone who had spent considerable time in the saddle, and his clothing, while dark and concealing, appeared to be of good quality. The mysterious burlap sack never shifted or slipped, as if it had been carefully secured to stay in place no matter what. Around midday, Samuel called a halt near a cluster of large rocks that provided some shade. He dismounted and helped Rebecca down from her horse, his hands briefly touching her waist as he steadied her. Even through her dress and his gloves, the contact made her skin crawl with an unpleasant sensation she couldn't quite identify. "We'll rest here during the hottest part of the day," Samuel said, leading the horses to a small pool of water that had collected among the rocks. "It's important that you don't become overheated in your condition." Rebecca settled into the shade gratefully, her back aching from the unfamiliar position of riding while pregnant. She unwrapped the food her mother had prepared and offered some to Samuel, but he declined. "I have my own provisions," he said. Though Rebecca noticed he never actually ate anything during their rest stop. As they sat in the shade, Rebecca decided to try asking some of the questions that had been bothering her since the previous evening. "Samuel, can you tell me more about your aunt? What's her name? How long has she lived alone?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, and Rebecca had the sense that he was carefully considering his answer. "Her name is Dolores," he said finally. "She's been alone since my uncle died about 5 years ago. She was deeply affected by his loss and has become quite reclusive since then." "What did your uncle die from?" "An accident," Samuel replied curtly, in a tone that suggested he didn't want to discuss the matter further. Rebecca tried a different approach. You mentioned that other young women have worked as her companion. How many others? Again, that pause. Before answering, 3 or 4 over the years. All of them found the arrangement satisfactory. And they all left voluntarily? Of course, Samuel said, but something in his tone made Rebecca's blood run cold. My aunt would never keep anyone against their will. The way he emphasized the word keep sent chills down Rebecca's spine. There was something about his phrasing that suggested other possibilities, not keeping someone against their will, but perhaps preventing them from leaving through other means. Where exactly is your aunt's house? Rebecca asked. You said it was north of here, but can you be more specific? Samuel gestured vaguely toward the horizon. It's isolated, which is part of why she needs a companion. The nearest town is quite far away, and she doesn't receive many visitors. More evasive answers that revealed nothing concrete. Rebecca was beginning to realize that for all their conversation, she knew virtually nothing about where she was going or what she would find. When she got there, as the afternoon wore on and they resumed their journey, the landscape began to change. The flat desert gave way to more rugged terrain, with steep canyons and towering rock formations that seemed to close in around them. The trail they were following became less distinct, branching off in multiple directions that all looked the same to Rebecca's inexperienced eye. She began to worry about finding her way back home if something went wrong. Samuel had promised to provide her with maps and directions, but so far she had seen no evidence of such things. Every landmark looked the same to her, and she was already losing track of which direction they had come from. As evening approached, Samuel led them to what appeared to be a natural shelter formed by an overhang of rock. There was evidence that other travelers had camped here before, the remains of old fires and areas where the ground had been cleared of rocks. We'll spend the night here, Samuel announced, dismounting and beginning to unsaddle his horse. Rebecca looked around nervously. The shelter was isolated and hidden, perfect for privacy, but also perfect for concealing whatever might happen here. She realized with growing alarm that she was now completely dependent on this mysterious stranger, miles from home with no way to get back on her own. Samuel, she said carefully, I'd like to see those maps you mentioned. The ones showing how to get to your aunt's house. Samuel paused in his work with the horses. Of course. I'll show them to you after we've set up camp. But as they prepared their sleeping areas and Samuel built a small fire, he made no move to produce any maps. When Rebecca asked about them, again, he claimed they were packed away and difficult to reach in the dark. Tomorrow, he said. I'll show you everything tomorrow. Rebecca settled down on her blanket, acutely aware that she was spending the night alone in the wilderness with a man whose face she had never seen, whose real name she didn't know, and whose true intentions were becoming more questionable by the hour. The baby kicked restlessly inside her, and Rebecca placed protective hands over her belly. Whatever happened, she had to keep this child safe. But as she lay there listening to the strange sounds of the desert night and watching Samuel's motionless figure across the fire, she began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. The burlap sack that covered his head never moved, never shifted, as if he wasn't really sleeping at all. And somewhere in the darkness beyond their camp, Rebecca could swear she heard the sound of other horses, other riders, moving through the night. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but rest wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself planning, thinking about how she might escape if necessary, how she might protect herself and her unborn child if Samuel's true intentions proved to be darker than his promises suggested. Miles from home, alone in the wilderness with a stranger whose face remained hidden, Rebecca began to understand that her real journey was just beginning. And whatever lay ahead in the mysterious house where Samuel was taking her, she had the growing certainty that it would be nothing like what she had been promised. The second day of their journey brought with it a discovery that would forever changed Rebecca's understanding of the man she was traveling with. She woke before dawn to find Samuel already up and moving about their camp. But what caught her attention wasn't his early activity, it was what she glimpsed in the pale morning light. When he thought she was still sleeping, Samuel was kneeling beside the small stream that ran near their campsite, and he had lifted the edge of his burlap, covering just enough to drink. In that brief moment, Rebecca caught sight of something that made her blood freeze, the unmistakable silhouette of a perfectly normal human profile. No disfigurement, no horrible scarring that would require concealment. Just the clean lines of a man's jaw and neck. Rebecca quickly closed her eyes and forced her breathing to remain steady, but her mind was racing. If Samuel wasn't hiding a physical deformity, then why the elaborate deception with the burlap sack? What was he really concealing? And more importantly, what did this mean for her safety? She lay still for several more minutes, listening to Samuel move around their camp, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must be able to hear it. When she finally woke up and sat up with a theatrical stretch, Samuel was back to his normal position by the dying fire, the burlap sack firmly in place. "Good morning, Rebecca," he said in his usual courteous tone. "I trust you slept well?" "As well as can be expected," she replied, studying his covered face with new eyes. Now that she knew he wasn't disfigured, every interaction felt different, more dangerous. "How much farther to your aunt's house?" "We should arrive by tomorrow evening," Samuel said, beginning to pack up their camp. "Today's journey will take us through some particularly beautiful country." Beautiful country that was also increasingly remote and isolated, Rebecca noted silently. With each mile they traveled, they moved farther from any possibility of help or rescue. She was beginning to understand that this might be exactly what Samuel intended. As they resumed their ride, Rebecca found herself paying much closer attention to their surroundings. She tried to memorize landmarks, distinctive rock formations, unusual trees, anything that might help her find her way back if she needed to escape. The task was made more difficult by the fact that much of the landscape looked similar, but she persisted, knowing her life might depend on it. The terrain continued to grow more rugged and challenging. They rode through narrow canyons where the walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, blocking out much of the sky and creating an oppressive sense of being trapped. The trail they followed was barely visible now, little more than occasional marks on rock surfaces and disturbed areas where previous travelers had passed. During their midday rest in the shade of a towering cliff, Rebecca decided to test Samuel's knowledge of the area. "This is certainly remote country," she commented, looking around at the wild landscape. "Do you travel this way often?" "Often enough," Samuel replied. "My aunt's location requires a certain amount of isolation." "It must be difficult for her, living so far from medical care," Rebecca pressed. "What happens if she becomes ill?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. "My aunt has unconventional approaches to health and healing. She rarely requires outside medical attention." Another vague answer that raised more questions than it answered. Rebecca was beginning to see a clear pattern in Samuel's responses. Everything was carefully phrased to avoid giving specific information while sounding reasonable on the surface. "You mentioned Dr. Whitfield in Flagstaff," Rebecca said, pulling out the letter Samuel had shown her father. "How does your aunt maintain contact with her if they live so far apart?" "Dr. Whitfield makes house calls when necessary," Samuel said. But there was something in his tone that suggested uncertainty. Rebecca studied the letter more carefully than she had the night before. The paper was expensive, and the handwriting was educated, but something about it struck her as odd. The language was formal to the point of being stilted, and there were no specific details about Samuel's aunt or her medical needs. "Samuel," Rebecca said carefully, "would it be possible for me to speak with Dr. Whitfield directly? Perhaps when we reach your aunt's house?" The question seemed to catch Samuel off guard. He turned toward her, and even through the burlap sack, She could sense his sharp attention. "That might be difficult to arrange," he said finally. "Dr. Whitfield's schedule is quite demanding, and she doesn't often travel to such remote locations. But you said she makes house calls when necessary. For emergencies, yes. But routine consultations are handled differently." Once again, Samuel's explanation sounded reasonable while providing no real information. Rebecca was beginning to suspect that Dr. Whitfield might not exist at all, or if she did, she might know nothing about Samuel or his supposed Aunt Dot. As they prepared to resume their journey, Rebecca noticed something else that troubled her. Samuel's horse was showing signs of being extremely well trained for difficult terrain and long distances. But more than that, the animal seemed accustomed to traveling these specific trails. The horse navigated the rough ground with the confidence of an animal that had made this journey many times before. How many times had Samuel traveled this route? How many other young women had he transported along these same isolated trails to his mysterious aunt's house? And if they had all left voluntarily and safely, as he claimed, why did he need to keep finding new companions? The questions multiplied in Rebecca's mind as the afternoon wore on. She found herself studying every aspect of Samuel's behavior, looking for clues about his true intentions. She noticed that he never removed his gloves, even when the heat became oppressive. She observed that he ate very little and always turned away from her when he did. Most disturbing of all, she began to catch glimpses of what looked like other travelers' belongings among his supplies: a woman's hairbrush, a delicate handkerchief, a small silver locket that definitely didn't belong to a man. By evening, when they made camp in another isolated spot among the rocks, Rebecca's unease had grown into genuine fear. She was now convinced that Samuel was not what he seemed, that his aunt probably didn't exist, and that she was in serious danger. But she was also pregnant, alone, and miles from home with no way to escape. She would have to be clever, patient, and extremely careful if she hoped to survive whatever Samuel had planned for her. As they settled down for their second night together, Rebecca made a decision. She would pretend to sleep while keeping watch. And if Samuel revealed anything more about his true nature or intentions, she would be ready to act. The fire burned low as darkness settled over their camp. Samuel sat motionless on the far side of the flames, the burlap sack making him look like some sort of desert ghost. Rebecca lay on her blanket with her eyes nearly closed, breathing deeply and evenly to simulate sleep. Hours passed before Samuel finally moved. Rebecca heard the soft sound of him standing up, followed by the gentle whisper of his footsteps moving away from the fire. She waited several minutes, then carefully opened her eyes and looked around. Samuel was nowhere to be seen, but she could hear him moving about somewhere in the darkness beyond their camp. There were soft sounds of activity rustling fabric, the clink of metal objects, and what sounded like him talking quietly to himself. Rebecca slipped carefully from her blanket and crept toward the edge of their camp, staying low and moving as silently as possible. Her pregnant belly made stealth difficult, but desperation gave her grace she didn't know she possessed. Following the sounds, she found Samuel about 50 yards from their camp, working by moonlight near a large boulder. What she saw there made her stomach turn with horror and revulsion. Samuel had removed the burlap sack from his head, revealing a face that was indeed unmarked by any disfigurement. But that wasn't what made Rebecca's blood run cold. It was what he was doing with his hands, and what was scattered on the ground around him. There were personal belongings everywhere: women's jewelry, hair ornaments, pieces of clothing, and other intimate items that clearly belonged to multiple different people. Samuel was sorting through them methodically, examining each piece before placing it into one of several small bags. But most horrifying of all were the scalps. 7 of them hung on a makeshift drying rack, each one clearly taken from a different woman. The hair colors varied: blonde, brown, black, red, but they all had one thing in common. They had all belonged to young women, probably around Rebecca's age. Rebecca pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp of horror. Now she understood why Samuel kept his face covered, why he was so evasive about his aunt and the other companions, why he chose such isolated routes for his travels. He wasn't taking her to serve as a companion to an elderly woman. He was taking her somewhere far from civilization where he could kill her and add her scalp to his grisly collection. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This man was a killer, a predator who targeted desperate young women with promises of help and salvation. How many others had he convinced to trust him? How many had made this same journey into the wilderness, believing they were traveling toward safety, only to discover too late that they were riding toward their deaths? Rebecca began to back away slowly, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain Samuel must hear it. She had to get back to camp, had to pretend she was still sleeping, had to figure out how to escape before he finished whatever ritual he was performing with his trophies. But as she turned to creep back toward their campfire, her foot dislodged a small stone that went rattling down the rocky slope. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the desert silence. Samuel's head snapped up immediately, and in the moonlight, Rebecca could see his face clearly for the first time. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30 years old, with sharp features and cold, intelligent eyes. But it was his expression that made her blood freeze. The look of a predator who had just realized his prey was no longer where he had left it. "Rebecca," Samuel called softly, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. "I know you're out there. Why don't you come back to camp? We need to talk." Rebecca pressed herself against the boulder, hoping the shadows would conceal her, but she knew it was useless. Samuel knew these rocks, knew this terrain, and knew exactly how to hunt someone in this environment. "I won't hurt you," Samuel continued, his tone reasonable and calm. "Not if you're smart about this. Come back to camp, and we can discuss your situation like civilized people." Rebecca knew she had no choice but to respond. Trying to hide would only delay the inevitable, and in her condition, she couldn't outrun him even if she tried. Her only hope was to play for time, to make him think she was still naive and trusting, and to wait for an opportunity to escape. "I'm here, Samuel," she called back, stepping out from behind the boulder with her hands visible. "I couldn't sleep, so I went for a walk. I'm sorry if I startled you." Samuel studied her face carefully, clearly trying to determine how much she had seen and understood. In the moonlight, without the burlap sack to conceal his features, he looked like a completely different person, younger, more dangerous, and infinitely more frightening. "Did you see anything interesting on your walk?" he asked casually. Rebecca met his gaze steadily, knowing that her life depended on convincing him she was still ignorant of his true nature. "Just rocks and moonlight," she said. "This country is beautiful, but it's so empty. I can't imagine how your aunt stands the isolation." Samuel smiled, and the expression was more terrifying than any threat could have been. It was the smile of someone who enjoyed having complete power over another person's life and death. "My aunt has learned to appreciate solitude," he said. "Perhaps you will too in time." As they walked back toward their camp together, Rebecca's mind raced with desperate plans for escape. She was 6 months pregnant, alone in the wilderness with a killer, and still at least a day's ride from whatever destination Samuel had in mind for her. But she was also alive, and as long as she remained alive, there was hope. Somewhere in this vast desert landscape, she would find a way to survive, to protect her unborn child, and to escape the nightmare she had unknowingly walked into. The question was whether she could stay ahead of Samuel's plans long enough to find that opportunity, or whether she would become the 8th scalp in his collection. The remainder of that night passed in a terrifying game of pretense. Rebecca lay on her blanket, feigning sleep while every muscle in her body remained tense with fear. Across the dying fire, Samuel sat motionless, but she could feel his eyes watching her through the darkness. He had replaced the burlap sack over his head, returning to his previous disguise. But the illusion of safety it had once provided was now completely shattered. Rebecca knew that. Samuel knew she had seen something. The question was how much he suspected she understood, and how long he would maintain the charade before deciding it was time to end her life. Every breath felt precious, every heartbeat a small victory against the inevitable dot as the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the desert sky. Samuel finally stirred from his vigil. Rebecca heard him moving about their camp with the same methodical efficiency he had shown on previous mornings, but now every sound seemed ominous. The clink of metal might be him preparing weapons. The rustle of fabric could be him packing away evidence of his previous crimes. "Good morning, Rebecca," Samuel said in his familiar courteous tone. "Our final day of travel begins today. By this evening, you'll be safely settled in my aunt's home." The word safely made Rebecca's skin crawl. She forced herself to sit up and stretch, playing the role of the trusting young woman who still believed his lies. "I'm looking forward to meeting her," Rebecca said, amazed at how steady her voice sounded. "Will you tell me more about her today? I'd like to know what to expect." Samuel paused in his packing, and Rebecca sensed his attention focusing on her. With uncomfortable intensity, "Of course," he said finally. "Aunt Dolores will be delighted to have such an interesting companion." The way he emphasized the word interesting sent chills down Rebecca's spine. She was beginning to understand that she might not be the first pregnant woman Samuel had targeted. The thought of what might have happened to the others, to their unborn children, made her feel physically sick. "Samuel," Rebecca said carefully, "I've been thinking about what happens after the baby is born. You mentioned that some of your aunt's previous companions chose to stay rather than return to their families. What made them decide to stay?" It was a dangerous question, but Rebecca needed to understand more about Samuel's methods and timeline. How long did he typically keep his victims alive? What was his ultimate plan for her and her child? Samuel finished packing his supplies before answering, and when he did speak, his tone was thoughtful, almost philosophical. "Many young women discover that isolation has its advantages," he said. "Away from the judgment and expectations of society, they find they can become different versions of themselves. Some find that transformation so liberating that they never want to return to their old lives." Rebecca forced herself to nod as if she found this explanation reasonable, but inside she was screaming. The transformation he was talking about wasn't liberation, it was death. Those women hadn't chosen to stay. They had been murdered and scalped, their lives cut short to feed Samuel's twisted desires. "That sounds wonderful," Rebecca said, placing her hands protectively over her belly. "I hope I'll find that same kind of peace." "I'm certain you will," Samuel replied, and there was something in his voice that made it sound like a promise and a threat combined. They broke camp and resumed their journey, but the dynamic between them had shifted dramatically. Rebecca was no longer a naive victim being led to slaughter. She was a woman fighting for her life and her child's life, engaged in a deadly game of deception with a killer who held all the advantages. The landscape they traveled through that day was even more remote and forbidding than what they had seen before. Towering mesas rose on all sides, creating a maze of canyons and dead ends that would be nearly impossible to navigate without extensive knowledge of the area. Rebecca tried to memorize their route, but the task seemed hopeless. Every turn looked the same. Every rock formation could be mistaken for a dozen others. As the morning wore on, Rebecca began to notice something else that made her situation even more desperate. Samuel's behavior was changing in subtle but unmistakable ways. He no longer maintained the polite distance he had shown on previous days. Instead, he rode closer to her, sometimes close enough that their horses nearly touched. He asked more personal questions about her pregnancy, her body, her fears about childbirth. "Tell me about the baby's father," Samuel said during one of these uncomfortable conversations. Was he a local boy? Someone you cared about? Rebecca had to fight to keep her voice steady. His name was Tommy Sullivan. He was passing through town and we fell in love quickly. Too quickly, it turned out. And he left when he learned about the baby? Yes, the day I told him. He was gone before morning. Samuel nodded as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. Men can be unreliable when faced with real responsibility. It's unfortunate that women so often have to bear the consequences of male weakness alone. There was something in his tone that suggested he saw himself as different from other men, perhaps even as someone who was helping these women by removing them from a world where men would only disappoint them. The twisted logic of his justifications made Rebecca's stomach turn. "Your aunt," Rebecca said, trying to redirect the conversation away from her personal life. "Has she ever been married? Does she have children of her own?" "Aunt Dolores was never blessed with children," Samuel replied. "It's one of the reasons she takes such pleasure in the company of young women who are expecting. She finds the experience of new life very fascinating." Rebecca's blood ran cold. The way Samuel spoke about his aunt's interest in pregnant women suggested something far more sinister than simple companionship. Was this mythical aunt another fiction? Or was there actually someone waiting at their destination who shared Samuel's twisted obsessions? As they stopped for their midday rest, Rebecca noticed that Samuel was becoming careless about maintaining his disguise. The burlap sack sat loosely on his head, and several times she caught glimpses of his actual face beneath it. He was a handsome man, she realized, with the kind of clean-cut features that would make most people trust him instinctively. No wonder he was able to find victims so easily. But it was his eyes that truly revealed his nature. When Rebecca caught sight of them through the holes in the burlap, they were cold and calculating, the eyes of someone who viewed other people as objects to be used and discarded rather than as fellow human beings deserving of respect and compassion. "Rebecca," Samuel said as they prepared to resume their journey, "I want you to know that whatever happens when we reach our destination, I want you to remember that everything I've done has been for your own good." The statement was so chilling that Rebecca had to bite her tongue to keep from screaming. Instead, she forced herself to smile and nod. "I understand, Samuel. I'm grateful for everything you've done for me and my family." "Good," Samuel said, studying her face carefully. "I'm glad you understand. Some women struggle with adjusting to new circumstances. I hope you'll be more adaptable." As they rode through the afternoon heat, Rebecca's mind raced with desperate plans for escape. She was now certain that whatever waited at the end of their journey would mean death for both her and her unborn child. She had to find a way to get away from Samuel before they reached their destination, but the terrain worked against her. They were now traveling through a narrow canyon with walls that rose hundreds of feet on either side. There was only one way in and one way out, and Samuel controlled both. Even if she could somehow overpower him, which seemed impossible given her pregnancy and his obvious physical advantages, she would still be trapped in this maze of rock with no idea how to find her way back to civilization. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her distress. Rebecca placed her hands over her belly and whispered a silent promise. Somehow she would find a way to save them both. She would not allow her child to die before it even had a chance to live. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Samuel announced that they were nearly at their destination. "Just around the next bend," he said, and there was an excitement in his voice that made Rebecca's skin crawl. "Aunt Dolores will be so pleased to finally meet you." Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs as they rounded the curve in the canyon. What she saw ahead of them defied every expectation she had formed about their destination. There was no house, no evidence of civilization, no sign that anyone had ever lived in this remote location. Instead, the canyon opened into a circular space surrounded by towering red rock walls. Ancient petroglyphs covered the stone surfaces, and the ground was marked with the remains of what looked like ceremonial fire circles. But most disturbing of all were the bones. Human bones scattered around the canyon floor and collected in neat piles near the base of the walls. Skulls grinned up at the darkening sky, and rib cages caught the last rays of sunlight like twisted musical instruments. "Welcome to your new home, Rebecca," Samuel said, his voice no longer carrying any pretense of warmth or compassion. "Welcome to the place where you'll finally understand the true purpose of your journey." Rebecca stared at the boneyard in horror, finally understanding the full scope of the nightmare she had walked into. There was no aunt, no house, no hope of rescue. There was only Samuel, his victims, and whatever twisted ritual he planned to perform with her and her unborn child. The baby kicked frantically inside her, and Rebecca realized that her time for pretense had run out. The final act of this deadly drama was about to begin, and she would need every ounce of courage and cunning she possessed if she hoped to survive what came next. As Samuel dismounted and began to remove the burlap sack from his head for the final time, Rebecca knew that the moment of truth had arrived. Soon she would see his true face, learn his real purpose, and discover whether she had the strength to fight for her life and her child's life against a killer who had already claimed so many others. The dance of deception was over. Now came the time for truth, terror, and the ultimate test of a mother's will to protect her child. Samuel pulled the burlap sack from his head with the slow deliberation of someone savoring a long-awaited moment. As the crude covering fell away, Rebecca found herself staring into a face that was both shockingly familiar and completely unexpected. The man standing before her was not the stranger she had believed him to be. The features were older now, marked by years and hardship she hadn't seen before, but there was no mistaking the jawline, the set of the eyes, the particular way he held his head when he was pleased with himself. "Hello, Rebecca," said Tommy Sullivan, the father of her unborn child, "surprised to see me." Rebecca's mind reeled as the impossible truth crashed over her like a physical blow. The man who had seduced and abandoned her, who had fled when she told him about the pregnancy, who had left her family to face destitution and shame, that same man had returned disguised as a stranger offering salvation, only to lead her into this nightmare of bones and death. "Tommy?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind that whistled through the canyon walls. "But why? How?" Tommy smiled, and it was the same charming expression that had once made her believe he loved her. Now it looked like the baring of teeth by a predator, finally revealing its true nature. "I told you I was a traveling man, Rebecca. I just never mentioned what kind of business I was in." He gestured around the bone-filled canyon with obvious pride. "This is my business. This is what I do." Rebecca's legs nearly gave out beneath her as the full scope of the deception became clear. Tommy hadn't stumbled into Copper Ridge by accident. He hadn't fallen in love with her by chance. Everything had been calculated, planned, designed to put her exactly where she was now. "You came to town specifically to find me," she said, words coming out flat and emotionless as shock numbed her ability to feel. "Not you specifically," Tommy corrected. "I was looking for the right kind of girl. Young, naive, isolated, desperate for love and attention. You just happened to fit the requirements perfectly." He began walking around the canyon, moving among the scattered bones with the casual familiarity of someone who had spent considerable time in this place. Rebecca noticed that some of the skulls were smaller than others, and with growing horror, she realized that some of them had belonged to children. "Or babies, how many?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "You'll be number 23, Tommy said, kicking absently at a rib cage that crumbled under the impact, though some of them came with additional numbers. The meaning of his words hit Rebecca like a hammer blow. He wasn't just killing pregnant women. He was killing their unborn children too, and from the scattered small bones, She could see that some of those children had been born before they died. "You're insane," Rebecca breathed, her hand moving protectively to her belly. "I'm practical," Tommy corrected. "Do you have any idea how much money people will pay for certain specialty items? Particularly items that come from young mothers and their children." Rebecca's stomach churned as she realized he wasn't just a killer, he was selling parts of his victims to people with equally twisted desires. The scalps she had seen were just the beginning of what he harvested from the women he murdered. "The letter from Dr. Whitfield," Rebecca said, her mind still struggling to process the enormity of the deception. "The references, the money, all real," Tommy said cheerfully. "Dr. Whitfield does exist, and she does pay very well for what I provide. She has unconventional medical research interests that require fresh specimens. The money your father received was just a down payment. The real payment comes after delivery." Rebecca felt bile rise in her throat. Her own father had unknowingly sold her to be murdered and butchered for medical experiments. The $5 that had seemed like salvation was actually blood money, payment for her death and dismemberment. "My parents," she said weakly. "They had no idea, of course not." Tommy agreed. "They thought they were saving your life. It's so much easier when the victims come willingly, when they trust you completely. Fighting and screaming gets so tiresome after a while." Tommy had finished his circuit of the canyon and was now approaching Rebecca with purpose. She backed away instinctively, but there was nowhere to go. The canyon walls rose sheer on all sides, and the only entrance was blocked by Tommy's position. "Now then," Tommy said, pulling a long knife from his belt, "let's discuss how this is going to work. I prefer to keep my subjects alive for as long as possible during the harvest. The fresher the specimens, the better the price. But I can make it quick if you cooperate." Rebecca's survival instincts finally overcame her shock. The baby kicked hard inside her, as if sensing the immediate danger. And suddenly Rebecca knew she would rather die fighting than submit to Tommy's knife. "Stay away from me," she said, looking around desperately for anything she could use as a weapon. "Rebecca, don't make this harder than it needs to be," Tommy said in the same reasonable tone he had used as Samuel. "Think about your family. Your father took my money. If you don't fulfill your part of the bargain, I might have to collect my payment in other ways." The threat to her parents gave Rebecca a surge of rage that burned through her terror. This monster had manipulated her family's desperation, used their love for her against them, and now he was threatening to hurt them if she didn't submit to being murdered. "You bastard," Rebecca snarled, grabbing a piece of broken pottery from the ground near one of the fire circles. "You lying, murdering bastard." She hurled the pottery shard at Tommy's head with all the strength she could muster. He ducked easily, laughing at her attempt to fight back. "That's the spirit I remember," he said, advancing on her again. "You always were more interesting when you were angry." Rebecca backed away, scanning the ground for more weapons, anything that might give her a chance. The ancient fire circles were littered with artifacts, broken pottery, stone tools, pieces of metal that might have been left by previous victims. But Tommy was between her and most of them, and her pregnant belly made movement difficult. "Tell me," Tommy said conversationally as he stalked her around the canyon. "How did you like my performance as the mysterious Samuel?" "I thought the burlap sack was a nice touch, very dramatic." "I knew something was wrong," Rebecca said, trying to keep him talking while she maneuvered toward a larger piece of stone. "Your story never made sense." "But you came anyway," Tommy pointed out. "Even when your instincts told you something was off, you still climbed on that horse and followed me into the wilderness. Do you know why?" Rebecca didn't answer, focusing all her attention on reaching the stone weapon without alerting Tommy to her intention. "Because you wanted to believe," Tommy continued. "You wanted to believe that someone cared enough to save you, that there was a solution to all your problems. You wanted to believe so badly that you ignored every warning sign. He was right, and Rebecca hated him for it. She had ignored her doubts because the alternative accepting that there was no help coming, no salvation for her or her family had been too terrible to contemplate. That's what makes you all so easy to catch, Tommy said, still advancing. Slowly, desperate people will believe almost anything if it offers them hope. Rebecca's fingers closed around the stone she had been aiming for. It was roughly the size of her fist, heavy enough to do damage if she could connect with Tommy's head. But she would only get one chance, and if she missed, Tommy would be ready for her. You know what the funny thing is? Tommy said, now only a few feet away from her. I actually enjoyed our time together in Copper Ridge. You were sweet, innocent, genuinely caring. Under different circumstances, I might have even considered keeping you around. But business is business, Rebecca said, echoing his earlier tone. Exactly, Tommy agreed, raising his knife. Now let's get started. I promise to make the first cuts quick. Rebecca waited until Tommy was close enough to strike, then brought the stone up in a vicious uppercut aimed at his jaw. But Tommy was faster than she had anticipated. He caught her wrist with his free hand, stopping the attack inches from his face. Nice try, he said, twisting her wrist until she was forced to drop the stone. But I've had a lot of practice at this. Rebecca cried out in pain as Tommy's grip tightened. But the sound seemed to awaken something in the canyon around them. From high above on the canyon walls came an answering, crying not human, but definitely alive. Tommy looked up sharply, his attention momentarily diverted from Rebecca. In that instant of distraction, she drove her knee up into his groin with all the force she could manage. Tommy doubled over with a grunt of pain, releasing his grip on her wrist. Rebecca didn't waste time gloating. She ran, heading for the canyon entrance with her heart pounding and her breath coming in gasps. But even as she fled, she could hear Tommy's laughter echoing off the canyon walls behind her. Run all you want. Rebecca, he called after her. There's only one way out of this canyon, and I know these rocks better than you ever will. You're just making this more fun for me. Rebecca reached the narrow entrance to the canyon and looked out at the maze of passages beyond. Tommy was right. She had no idea which way led back toward civilization and which paths would only take her deeper into the wilderness. But staying in the canyon meant certain death, so she chose a direction at random and ran into the gathering. Darkness behind her. Tommy's voice continued to echo from the bone-filled canyon. I'll give you a head start, Rebecca. Let you get nice and tired before I come after you. It'll make the chase more interesting. As Rebecca stumbled through the narrow passages between the towering rock walls, she realized that her nightmare was far from over. She had escaped the immediate threat, but she was now alone in hostile territory, pregnant and exhausted, being hunted by a man who knew these rocks like his own backyard. The baby kicked frantically inside her, and Rebecca whispered apologies for the danger she had brought upon them both. But she also made a promise. She would not give up, would not submit to Tommy's knife, would find a way to survive and protect her child. Somewhere in this maze of stone and shadow, there had to be a path to safety. She just had to live long enough to find it. The maze of canyons that stretched beyond Tommy's killing ground was a labyrinth of shadow and stone that seemed designed to trap the unwary. Rebecca stumbled through narrow passages barely wide enough for her swollen body, her hands pressed against the rock walls on either side for guidance in the growing darkness. Every few steps she had to stop and listen, straining to hear any sound that might indicate Tommy was following her. But the desert night was alive with sounds that masked human pursuit. The whisper of wind through stone archways, the distant howl of coyotes, the scurrying of small creatures among the rocks. Any of these noises could be hiding the sound of Tommy's footsteps, and the uncertainty was almost worse than knowing he was there. Rebecca's pregnancy made the flight even more treacherous. Her center of gravity was thrown off by the weight of the baby making it difficult to navigate the uneven terrain in the dark. Her back ached constantly, and the child seemed to sense her distress, kicking and moving restlessly inside her. Every few minutes she had to stop and rest, leaning against the canyon walls while she caught her breath and fought off waves of dizziness. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Rebecca found herself at a junction where 3 different passages split off in different directions. In the pale moonlight filtering down from above, they all looked identical narrow corridors between towering walls of red stone that could lead anywhere or nowhere. She chose the middle passage, hoping it might take her back toward the general direction they had come from earlier that day. But after walking for another 20 minutes, she realized she was only going deeper into the maze. The walls around her were growing higher and closer together, and she could no longer see any stars. Overhead, panic began to set in as Rebecca understood the full scope of her situation. She was lost in a wilderness that could kill her just as effectively as Tommy's knife, and she had no food, no water, and no way to signal for help. Even if she managed to avoid Tommy, she could still die of exposure or dehydration long before. She found her way back to civilization. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, and Rebecca placed both hands over her belly. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the child. "I'm so sorry I brought us into this." But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, Rebecca felt a stubborn spark of determination ignite in her chest. This baby deserved a chance at life, deserved to grow up and experience all the things that Tommy's previous victims had been denied. She couldn't give up now, not when her child's life depended on her survival. Rebecca forced herself to think practically about her situation. Tommy had given her a head start, which meant he was confident in his ability to track her down. That confidence probably came from extensive knowledge of these canyons, knowledge that Rebecca lacked. But Tommy also thought he was hunting a naive girl who would panic and make mistakes. He didn't know that Rebecca had grown up helping her father track lost cattle in the desert around Copper Ridge. She understood basic survival principles, even if she'd never applied them in terrain this challenging. The first priority was finding water. Rebecca knew she couldn't survive more than a day or 2 without it, especially in her condition. The second priority was finding some kind of shelter where she could rest and plan her next move. The third priority was figuring out how to get out of this maze and back to safety. As Rebecca continued through the twisting passages, she began paying closer attention to the rock formations around her. The ancient petroglyphs that covered many of the walls told stories of the people who had lived in this region long before. Tommy turned it into his private killing ground. Some of the symbols seemed to indicate water sources, and Rebecca found herself studying them carefully, hoping they might provide clues about where to find springs or pools. After another hour of walking, Rebecca's prayers were answered. She heard the soft sound of trickling water echoing off the canyon walls ahead of her. Following the sound, she discovered a small spring that bubbled up from the rocks and formed a clear pool about the size of a bathtub. Before disappearing back into the stone, Rebecca knelt beside the pool and cupped the cold water in her hands. Drinking deeply, it tasted clean and sweet, and she felt some of her strength returning as she hydrated. She also took the opportunity to wash the dust and sweat from her face and hands, trying to think clearly about what to do next. The spring was located in a small alcove that was partially hidden from the main passage. It would provide good cover if she needed to rest, but it could also become a trap if Tommy found her there. Rebecca decided to take the risk. She needed rest more than she needed to keep moving. Blindly through the maze, she settled herself as comfortably as possible against the back wall of the alcove, where she would be hidden from casual observation but could still see anyone approaching. The baby had finally settled down, and for the first time since discovering Tommy's true identity, Rebecca felt a moment of relative peace. But that peace was shattered by the sound of Tommy's voice echoing through the canyons. Much closer than she had expected. Rebecca, he called, his tone cheerful and conversational. I know you can hear me, so let's have a little chat while I track you down. Rebecca pressed herself further back into the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. Tommy sounded like he was maybe 2 or 3 passages away, close enough that she could make out every word clearly. You know, I've been thinking about our time together in Copper Ridge, Tommy continued, his voice bouncing off the canyon walls from multiple directions, making it impossible to pinpoint his exact location. You really were special, Rebecca. Most of the girls I court are so easy to manipulate, so desperate for attention, that they'll believe anything. But you had spirit. You asked questions. You made me work for your trust. Rebecca bit her lip to keep from making any sound. Tommy was trying to draw her out, trying to make her respond or reveal her location. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. I particularly enjoyed that night when you told me about the baby, Tommy went on. The look on your face when you realized I was leaving, that moment when hope turned to despair. It was beautiful, Rebecca. Pure and honest in a way that most people never achieve. The casual cruelty in his words made Rebecca's stomach turn. Tommy wasn't just a killer, he was someone who fed on emotional suffering as much as physical violence. The seduction in Copper Ridge hadn't just been a means to an end. It had been part of the pleasure he derived from his crimes. But I have to admit, I'm impressed with how you've handled tonight, Tommy continued. Running into the maze was smart. Most girls just cower in the canyon and beg for mercy. Though I suppose you realize by now that begging won't help you. Rebecca heard the sound of footsteps on stone, still distant, but definitely getting closer. Tommy was methodically working his way through the passages, probably following some kind of systematic search pattern. Eventually, he would reach her hiding place. Tell me, Rebecca, what do you think your parents are doing right now? Tommy asked. Do you think they're lying awake worrying about you? Do you think they've figured out that their precious daughter is never coming home? The psychological torture was almost worse than the physical threat. Tommy knew exactly how to hurt her, knew that her love for her family was her greatest vulnerability. Rebecca closed her eyes and tried to block out his words, but they seemed to echo endlessly off the canyon walls. Maybe I'll pay them a visit. After I'm finished with you, Tommy continued. Tell them how brave their daughter was in her final moments. How she fought to protect the baby right up until the end. I think they'd appreciate knowing that. The threat to her parents sent a surge of rage through Rebecca that temporarily overcame her fear. Tommy wasn't content with killing her and her child. He wanted to torment her parents as well, to make them suffer for the rest of their lives. With guilt and grief, Rebecca forced herself to think strategically instead of emotionally. Tommy was talking to distract her, but his voice was also revealing his location. He was working his way through the passages systematically, but he wasn't taking the most direct route. That suggested he didn't know exactly where she was. He was searching, not pursuing. That gave Rebecca an advantage, if she was smart enough to use it. Instead of waiting passively for Tommy to find her, she could try to move away from his search pattern. The maze that was trapping her could also work against him if she was clever about it. Rebecca waited until Tommy's voice seemed to be moving away from her position, then carefully made her way out of the alcove. She had memorized the way she had come, and now she retraced her steps as quietly as possible, heading back toward one of the other passages she had passed earlier. Getting tired yet, Rebecca? Tommy called out, his voice now definitely more distant. Pregnancy makes running so much more difficult. All that extra weight, the changes in your body, it must be exhausting. Rebecca ignored his taunts and focused on moving silently through the maze. She had managed to put some distance between them, but she knew it was only temporary. Tommy had experience hunting in this terrain, and he would eventually figure out her new location. As she moved through a particularly narrow passage, Rebecca noticed something that made her pause. There were scratches on the walls, not ancient, Petroglyphs, but fresh marks that looked like they had been made with metal tools. Following the scratches, she discovered what appeared to be a crude map carved into the stone, showing various passages and their connections. Rebecca studied the map carefully, trying to understand its meaning. It seemed to show multiple routes through the maze, with some passages marked with symbols that might indicate dead ends or dangerous areas. Most importantly, one route was marked with what looked like an arrow pointing toward what might be an exit. The map had to be Tommy's way for him to navigate the maze during his hunts. But now it might be Rebecca's salvation, if she could understand it correctly and use it to find her way out. "I can smell your fear, Rebecca," Tommy called out, his voice echoing from a different direction now. "It's getting stronger. You're running out of places to hide." Rebecca committed the map to memory as best she could, then continued moving through the maze. She was no longer running blindly. She had a plan, a route that might lead to freedom. But she also knew that Tommy was getting closer, and time was running out. The hunt that had begun in Tommy's bone-filled canyon was now a deadly game of cat and mouse in a labyrinth of stone. Rebecca was no longer just trying to survive. She was trying to escape, to make it back to the world of the living and warn others about the monster who preyed on desperate families. Behind her, Tommy's laughter echoed through the darkness. And Rebecca knew that the most dangerous part of her ordeal was just beginning. Following Tommy's crude map carved into the canyon wall, Rebecca made her way through passages that seemed to lead steadily upward. The route was treacherous in the darkness, with loose rocks that threatened to send her tumbling and narrow ledges that barely accommodated her pregnant form. But the arrow symbol on the map had pointed this way, and it was her only hope of finding an exit from the maze. As she climbed higher into the canyon system, Rebecca began to notice changes in her surroundings. The walls here were covered with more elaborate petroglyphs than she had seen before, not just simple symbols, but complex scenes depicting human figures, animals, and what appeared to be ceremonial activities. Some of the images seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight, as if they had been painted with minerals that reflected the pale light. But it was the sound that made Rebecca pause and listen carefully. From somewhere ahead came a rhythmic noise that didn't match anything she had heard before in the desert, a soft repetitive tapping like metal striking stone. It was deliberate and purposeful, not the random sounds of wind or falling rocks. Rebecca crept forward cautiously, following the sound until she reached a bend in the passage where she could peer around the corner without being seen. What she discovered there defied every expectation. She had formed about this desolate place. An elderly Navajo man sat cross-legged on a flat stone, working by the light of a small fire that had been carefully built to produce minimal smoke. He was using a hammer and chisel to carve symbols into a piece of red sandstone, adding to a collection of similar carved stones that surrounded his workspace. His long gray hair was braided with feathers and beads, and his weathered hands moved with the practiced precision of someone who had been doing this work for many years. Rebecca stared in amazement. The man appeared to be completely alone and unarmed, yet he showed no signs of fear or concern about being in what she now knew was Tommy's hunting ground. Either he was unaware of the danger, or he had some protection that she couldn't see. As if sensing her presence, the old man looked up from his work and spoke quietly without turning in her direction. "You can come out, child. I have been waiting for you." Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs. There was no way this stranger could have known she was there, yet his words seemed directed specifically at her. After a moment of hesitation, she stepped around the corner and into the firelight. "You're not safe here," Rebecca whispered urgently. "There's a man, a killer. He's somewhere in these canyons looking for me." The old man set down his tools and studied Rebecca's face with dark eyes that seemed to see more than just her physical appearance. His expression was calm and knowing, as if her arrival had been expected rather than surprising. "I know about the one who calls himself Samuel," he said quietly. "I know about the Bone Canyon where he takes the young women. I know about you, Rebecca Martinez, and the child you carry. Rebecca's legs nearly gave out beneath her. How do you know my name? How do you know about any of this? Sick child. You need rest, and there are things you must understand before your ordeal can end. Rebecca looked around nervously, acutely aware that Tommy could appear at any moment. I can't stay. He's hunting me, and if he finds me here, he will not find you while you are under my protection, the old man said, with quiet certainty. Sit, drink water. Let me tell you about the man you knew as Tommy Sullivan. Despite every instinct screaming at her to keep running, Rebecca found herself settling onto a flat rock near the fire. There was something about the old man's presence that radiated calm and safety, something that made her believe his promise of protection, even though she couldn't understand how he could possibly defend them against Tommy's violence. The old man handed her a gourd filled with cool water, and Rebecca drank gratefully before asking the question that was burning in her mind. Who are you? My name is Joseph Begay. I am a medicine man of the dying, what you call Navajo, and I am the guardian of this sacred place. Sacred place? Rebecca looked around at the harsh canyon walls. This is where Tommy kills people. Where he keeps their bones. Joseph nodded gravely. Yes, and that is why I am here. This place was sacred to my people long before the killer came. These canyons contain the spirits of our ancestors, and they have been defiled by his presence. I have been waiting for the right moment to cleanse this place and stop his evil. Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air. How long have you known about Tommy? I have been watching him for 3 years, Joseph replied. Ever since he killed the first young woman in the Bohm Canyon. I tried to warn the authorities in the towns where he found his victims, but they would not listen to an old Indian man telling stories about a white killer they had never seen. 3 years, Rebecca repeated, thinking about all the women who had died while Joseph tried unsuccessfully to get help. Why didn't you stop him yourself? Joseph's expression grew sad. I am old, child, and he is young and strong. But more than that, there are spiritual laws that govern when and how such interventions can occur. I could not act until the right moment, when the spirits align to allow justice to be done. And you think that moment is now? I know it is now, Joseph said with quiet certainty. You are not just another victim, Rebecca. You are the key to ending his evil, though you do not yet understand how. Before Rebecca could ask what he meant, Tommy's voice echoed through the canyons, much closer than before. Rebecca, I know you're tired by now. Why don't you just give up and make this easy on both of us? Rebecca tensed, ready to run again, but Joseph placed a calming hand on her arm. He cannot see the fire, Joseph explained. I have placed protections around this space that will hide us from his sight, as long as you remain calm and trust in their power. Rebecca stared at the old man in disbelief. Protections? What kind of protections? The kind that your people do not believe in, but which are nonetheless real, Joseph replied. The spirits of this place are angry about the desecration that has occurred here. They are ready to help end it, but they need a willing vessel through which to work. A vessel? Rebecca's voice rose in alarm. What does that mean? It means, child, that you have a choice to make. You can continue running through this maze until exhaustion and pregnancy make it impossible to go on, and then become the 23rd victim in his collection. Or you can allow the spirits to work through you to ensure that he never kills again. Rebecca's mind reeled as she tried to process what Joseph was suggesting. He seemed to be talking about some kind of supernatural intervention, which her rational mind rejected as impossible. But she was sitting beside a fire that supposedly couldn't be seen by a man who was actively hunting her, having a conversation with a stranger who somehow knew her name and her entire situation. I don't understand, Rebecca said weakly. I'm just a pregnant girl from Copper Ridge. I don't have any special powers or abilities. "You have something more powerful than any special ability," Joseph replied. "You have the fierce love of a mother for her unborn child, and you have been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. When a person reaches that point, when they have nothing left to lose and everything to fight for, they become capable of things that normally would be impossible." Tommy's voice rang out again, and this time he sounded frustrated. "I'm getting bored with this game, Rebecca. When I find you and I will find you, I'm going to make sure you suffer extra for making me work so hard." Rebecca flinched at the venom in Tommy's tone, but Joseph remained completely calm. "He grows desperate," Joseph observed. "He knows that something has changed, that his usual hunt is not proceeding as it should. The spirits are already working against him, even before you make your choice." "What choice?" Rebecca demanded. "You keep talking about a choice, but you haven't told me what it actually is." Joseph stood up and walked to where his collection of carved stones lay arranged in a complex pattern around the fire. Each stone bore different symbols, and together they seemed to form some kind of ceremonial circle. "The choice is this," Joseph said. "You can take one of these stones and carry it with you as you continue to run. It will give you strength and guidance, and it may help you find your way out of the maze. You might escape, and you might live to warn others about the killer. Or you can stay here and allow me to perform a ceremony that will call upon the full power of this sacred place. The spirits will enter into you temporarily, giving you the strength and knowledge you need to confront the killer directly and end his evil forever." Rebecca stared at Joseph in horror. "You're asking me to fight him? I can't fight Tommy. He's stronger than me. He has weapons, and I'm 6 months pregnant. If you choose the ceremony, you will not be fighting as Rebecca Martinez," Joseph explained. "Patiently, you will be fighting as the vessel of every woman he has killed, every child he has murdered, every family he has destroyed. Their combined strength will be yours to command." The idea was terrifying and ridiculous in equal measure. Rebecca's rational mind insisted that what Joseph was describing was impossible, that spirits and ceremonies were just superstition and wishful thinking. But another part of her, a deeper part that connected to mysteries older than rational thought, recognized the truth in his words. "And if I choose the ceremony and it doesn't work?" Rebecca asked. "If I stay here and Tommy finds us, then we both die," Joseph said simply. "But at least we die fighting against evil instead of running from it." Tommy's voice echoed through the canyon again, and this time it was noticeably closer. "Decision time is running out, Rebecca. I can feel you nearby. Are you ready to stop playing games?" Rebecca looked at the carved stones arranged around the fire, then at Joseph's weathered face, then at her own hands resting protectively over her swollen belly. Everything in her life had led to this moment: her family's desperation, Tommy's deception, the journey into the wilderness, the discovery of his true nature. Now she had to decide how her story would end. Would she spend her final hours running through a maze like a frightened animal, hoping against hope for an escape that might not exist? Or would she stand and fight, not just for her own life and her child's life, but for all the victims who had died before her and all the potential victims who might die after? As Rebecca wrestled with the impossible choice, she felt the baby kick inside her, not the frantic movements of earlier, but a strong, deliberate kick that seemed to say, "Choose to fight." The decision crystallized in her mind with sudden clarity. She was tired of running, tired of being afraid, tired of allowing Tommy to control every aspect of this nightmare. It was time to take back some power, even if it meant risking everything. On the word of a mysterious medicine man and the supposed intervention of spirits she wasn't sure she believed in. "Tell me about this ceremony," Rebecca said firmly. "Tell me exactly what I need to do." Joseph Begay moved with ritualistic precision as he prepared the ceremony that would either save Rebecca's life or seal both their fates. He arranged the Carved stones in a perfect circle around the fire, each symbol facing inward toward where Rebecca now sat. The ancient petroglyphs on the canyon walls seemed to glow brighter in response to his movements, as if the very rock was awakening to witness what was about to unfold. The ceremony will open your spirit to the voices of those who have died here, Joseph explained as he worked. You will feel their pain, their fear, but also their strength and their desire for justice. You must not resist these feelings, even when they threaten to overwhelm you. Rebecca watched nervously as Joseph pulled items from a leather pouch: sage, sweetgrass, small pouches of colored sand, and what appeared to be fragments of bone. Those bones, she whispered, are they from the victims? Yes, Joseph confirmed. I have been collecting them over the years, preparing for this moment. Each piece carries the essence of the woman it belonged to. Together, they will give you the power you need. The baby kicked hard inside Rebecca's belly, and she gasped at the intensity of the movement. It was as if the child could sense the supernatural energy building around them and was responding to it. The baby, Rebecca said urgently. Will this hurt the baby? Joseph paused in his preparations and looked at her with compassionate eyes. The child you carry is special, Rebecca. It has been touched by both great evil and great love. The ceremony will not harm it. If anything, it will ensure that your child is born free from the darkness that has surrounded its conception. Tommy's voice echoed through the canyons again, much closer now. I can smell the smoke, Rebecca. Are you trying to signal for help? There's nobody coming to save you. Joseph quickly scattered sand over the fire, dampening the flames until they produced no visible smoke. He draws near, he said urgently. We must begin now, before his presence disrupts the spiritual balance we need. Rebecca nodded, her hands trembling as Joseph guided her to sit in the center of the stone circle. The carved symbols seemed to pulse with their own inner light as she settled into position. Close your eyes, Joseph instructed, beginning to chant in a language Rebecca didn't understand. Open your heart to the voices of the dead. Let them fill you with their purpose. As Joseph's chanting grew louder, Rebecca felt a strange tingling sensation begin in her fingertips and spread through her body. The air around her seemed to thicken, and she could swear she heard whispered voices speaking just below the threshold of understanding. Then the first spirit entered her consciousness, and Rebecca cried out in shock and pain. She was suddenly someone else, a young woman named Maria Santos, 19 years old and 3 months pregnant when Tommy had convinced her to leave her family in Santa Fe. Rebecca experienced Maria's terror as she realized the truth about Tommy's intentions, felt her desperate fight for survival in this same canyon, shared her anguish as Tommy's knife ended her life and her unborn child's future. Before Rebecca could recover from Maria's memories, another spirit merged with her consciousness. This time she was Elena Vargas, a 20-year-old seamstress from Flagstaff who had trusted Tommy's promises of work in a distant town. Rebecca lived through Elena's final moments, experienced her regret and rage, felt the weight of her unfulfilled dreams. One by one, the spirits of Tommy's victims joined with Rebecca's consciousness. Each brought their own memories of betrayal and murder, their own pain and anger, their own desperate desire for justice. Rebecca felt as if she might be torn apart by the intensity of their combined emotions, but somehow her maternal instinct to protect her unborn child kept her anchored to her own identity. Through it all, Joseph's chanting continued, weaving the separate spirits into a unified force focused on a single purpose: stopping Tommy Sullivan from ever killing again. When the last spirit had joined the collective consciousness within Rebecca, she opened her eyes and found herself changed. She was still Rebecca Martinez, but she was also 22 other women, 22 other voices demanding justice. Her body felt stronger, more capable, infused with a power that had nothing to do with physical strength and everything to do with righteous fury. It is done, Joseph said, his voice hoarse from chanting. "You are now the vessel of their vengeance. But remember, justice and revenge are not the same thing. You must allow the spirits to guide you toward justice, not let anger drive you toward mere killing." Rebecca stood up slowly, amazed at how natural the movement felt despite her pregnancy. The aches and pains that had plagued her throughout the day were gone, replaced by a sense of purpose and strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her own body. "How will I know what to do?" she asked. "Trust the voices," Joseph replied. "They have been waiting years for this opportunity. They will not waste it." The sound of approaching footsteps on stone announced Tommy's arrival. He appeared at the mouth of the passage leading to Joseph's ceremonial space, and Rebecca could see the surprise on his face when he spotted the fire and the two figures beside it. "Well, well," Tommy said, his knife glinting in the firelight. "What do we have here? Rebecca, you found yourself a friend." An old Indian medicine man by the look of him. Tommy's gaze swept over the circle of carved stones and the ceremonial items scattered around the fire. His expression shifted from surprise to contempt. "Playing with Indian magic, Rebecca? How desperate are you?" He laughed coldly. "This old man can't save you with his superstitions and fairy tales." Joseph stepped forward, placing himself between Tommy and Rebecca. "Leave this place, killer. You have defiled sacred ground long enough. Take your evil and go, before the spirits demand payment for your crimes." Tommy's laughter grew louder and more mocking. "Spirits? You think I'm afraid of ghost stories and primitive rituals?" He raised his knife threateningly. "The only spirits around here are going to be yours and Rebecca's when I'm finished with you both." But as Tommy stepped into the circle of stones, something changed in the atmosphere around them. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant, and the fire flared higher despite having no additional fuel. The petroglyphs on the canyon walls began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with reflected flames. Tommy paused, looking around nervously as the supernatural phenomena intensified. "Tricks," he said, but his voice had lost some of its confident mockery. "Clever tricks, but that's all they are." Rebecca felt the 22 spirits stirring within her consciousness, their combined will focusing on the man who had ended their lives. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that shouldn't have been possible from a single throat, the voices of all Tommy's victims speaking in unison. "Thomas James Sullivan," she said, and the name seemed to echo from every surface in the canyon. "Born in Kansas, orphaned at 12, first kill at 19 in a brothel in Denver. 23 women you have murdered, 23 unborn children you have destroyed, 23 families you have shattered with your evil." Tommy's face went pale as Rebecca recited details of his life that she couldn't possibly have known. "How do you know those things?" he demanded, raising his knife higher. "We know because we have been watching," Rebecca replied in that impossible chorus of voices. "Every victim you claimed added to our strength, increased our ability to see your true nature. You thought you were collecting trophies, but you were actually gathering the very forces that would destroy you." Tommy lunged forward with his knife, but Rebecca moved with speed and grace that defied her pregnant condition. The spirits guided her movements, 22 women's knowledge of Tommy's fighting style, combining to help her evade his attack with ease. As Tommy stumbled past her, off balance from his missed strike, Rebecca grabbed one of Joseph's carved stones from the circle. The moment her fingers closed around it, the stone began to glow with an intense white light that seemed to burn Tommy's eyes when he looked directly at it. "Impossible," Tommy snarled, backing away from the light. "This is just tricks and illusions." "Is it?" Rebecca asked, advancing on him with the glowing stone raised above her head. "Then why are you afraid?" Tommy tried to run, but found his path blocked by figures that shouldn't have been there, the translucent forms of his victims, standing between him and every possible escape route. Maria Santos, Elena Vargas, and 20 other women surrounded him, their ghostly hands reaching out to prevent his flight. "No!" Tommy screamed, swinging his knife at the apparitions, but the blade passed harmlessly through their ethereal forms. "You're dead. You're all dead. I killed you. Death is not the end for those who die with justice unserved," Rebecca said, the spirit speaking through her with absolute authority. "You have kept us bound to this place with your evil, but now we are free to claim what we are owed." The circle of ghostly victims began to close in on Tommy, and he fell to his knees in the center of their supernatural trap. His knife clattered to the ground as his hands shook uncontrollably. "Please," he begged, looking up at Rebecca with tears streaming down his face. "I'll leave. I'll never kill again, I promise. You promised Maria Santos you would take her to safety," Rebecca replied pitilessly. "You promised Elena Vargas you would marry her. You promised my parents you would care for me. Your promises are lies, Thomas Sullivan, and lies have no power here." The ghostly circle contracted further, and Tommy began to age before their eyes. His hair turned gray, then white. His skin became wrinkled and spotted, his back bent with the weight of accumulated years. The spirits were taking from him what he had stolen from them: time, future, possibility. "This is justice," Rebecca said as Tommy collapsed completely, his body now that of a man far older than his actual years. "You will live, but you will live with the weight of every life you have taken, every dream you have destroyed. You will carry their memories until your natural death, and then you will face their judgment in whatever comes after." Tommy tried to speak, but only a croak emerged from his aged throat. The man who had once been strong and confident was now a frail shell, broken by the supernatural justice of his victims. Not as the ghostly forms of the dead women began to fade, each one stopped to touch Rebecca's hand in farewell. She felt their gratitude, their peace, their relief at finally being free to move on to whatever awaited them beyond this world. When the last spirit had departed, Rebecca found herself alone with Joseph and the collapsed form of Tommy Sullivan. The baby kicked inside her belly, a normal, healthy kick that felt like a celebration of life returning to normal. "It is finished," Joseph said quietly. "The evil has been purged from this place, and the dead are at peace." Rebecca looked down at Tommy, who was breathing but unconscious, his body aged decades in the span of minutes. "What happens to him now?" "He will live as the spirits decreed," Joseph replied. "But he will never again be capable of the violence that defined his existence. The weight of his victims' memories will ensure that he spends his remaining years in horror at what he has done." 3 days later, Rebecca Martinez rode into Copper Ridge on Esperanza, leading Tommy's horse with its aged and broken rider slumped in the saddle. The townspeople gathered in amazement as she told them the story of the killer who had been preying on desperate families throughout the territory. Tommy Sullivan was taken into custody, though his advanced age and broken mental state meant he would spend his remaining years in an asylum rather than a prison. More importantly, his capture led to the discovery of his methods and the warning of other families who might have fallen victim to similar schemes. Rebecca's parents wept with joy and relief when she returned, amazed by their daughter's strength and the healthy baby she carried. The $5 they had received from Tommy was returned to the authorities as evidence, but the railroad offered Esteban steady work in gratitude for his daughter's role in stopping a notorious killer. 6 months later, Rebecca gave birth to a healthy daughter she named Elena Maria Martinez. Elena for one of Tommy's victims whose spirit had been particularly strong during the ceremony, and Maria for her own mother who had prayed unceasingly for her safe return. The baby was born with unusual eyes that seemed to see more than most infants. And as she grew, it became clear that she possessed an intuitive understanding of people's true natures that would serve her well throughout her life. Some said it was a gift from the spirits who had protected her before birth. Others called it simply the wisdom that comes from being born of a mother who had faced evil and chosen to fight back. Rebecca never spoke. publicly about the supernatural aspects of her ordeal, knowing that most people would dismiss such things as hallucinations brought on by stress and pregnancy. But she kept Joseph Begay's carved stone, and sometimes on quiet evenings, she would hold it and remember the voices of 22 women who had found peace through her courage. Years later, when Elena was old enough to understand, Rebecca told her daughter the full story of her birth and the spiritual forces that had shaped her earliest existence. Elena listened with the same serious attention she brought to all important matters, then asked a question that revealed the depth of her inherited wisdom. "Mama, do you think those women's spirits are still watching over us?" Rebecca looked at her daughter's unusual eyes, so full of compassion and understanding, and smiled. "I think they're watching over everyone now, Mia, making sure that evil, like Tommy Sullivan, never again finds fertile ground in desperate hearts." And in the distant canyons of Arizona, where ancient petroglyphs still glowed faintly in the moonlight, the wind carried whispers of gratitude and peace, the voices of women who had finally found the justice they deserved, and the promise that their sacrifice would protect future generations from similar darkness. The story of the father who sold his pregnant daughter for $5 had ended not in tragedy, but in triumph, the triumph of spiritual justice over human evil, of maternal love over predatory violence, and of hope over despair. Sometimes the most desperate choices lead to the most unexpected salvation, and sometimes the price of survival is paid not in money, but in the courage to stand against impossible odds and fight for what is right. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.